Welcome to the Quantum Biology Collective podcast, where we break down the practical applications of this emerging science, starting with healthy light habits and going wherever the quantum superhighway takes us. This is your host, executive and life coach Meredith Oak, with a quick reminder that podcasts are conversations, not consultations. But if you're looking for one of those, do check out our free practitioner directory at quantumbiologycollective.org. We are going on a fun ride today, people. It is going to be good. I have Dr. Teresa Bullard, Ph.D. Teresa is a Ph.D. physicist. Her degree is from the University of Washington in Seattle. She has over 12 years experience in experimental research, including neutrino physics, atomic physics, quantum physics, crystal chemistry, nanotechnology, origin of life studies, and more. However, she is also the author of a book called The Game Changers, Social Alchemists of the 21st Century, and a highly sought after speaker on personal development and spiritual development through a quantum lens. So I have been following Teresa's work for many years. I have found her to be a very clear communicator who really understands her subject very thoroughly from an academic perspective, but is one of those rare scientists who left the academic world, left standard physics to follow her heart and study all of the implications of science and from a more spiritual and esoteric perspective. She has a TV show on the Gaia Network called Mystery Teachings, which I really recommend. She does a great quantum physics breakdown in those episodes. And she also has a business with her husband called the Quantum Learning Academy, which she talks about in this episode. And she speaks all over the world and runs workshops and does all kinds of really cool stuff, and agreed to come on this podcast and chat with me. So I got to have a fan moment, when you've been watching someone for a long time and then all of a sudden you're talking to them. And we had a really interesting conversation. We talked about the esoteric impact of neutrinos. We will explain what those are, as well as the practical application of concepts like alchemy and how they are relevant to the present day metamorphosis that we're all going through personally and collectively as a culture. So enjoy. I don't know what else to say. This is a really fun conversation. Have a good time. Don't forget to visit bondcharge.com and make sure that you are getting lots of extra infrared light in your life during the winter, whether it's through a panel or my personal fave, which is an infrared sauna. You can get a sauna blanket there from them at bondcharge.com. Put QBC in the code box at checkout. Enjoy my conversation with Dr. Teresa Bullard. Dr. Teresa Bullard, welcome to the Quantum Biology Collective podcast. I am deeply delighted to be talking with you today. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you, Meredith, for the invitation.
So as we were just chatting about, I first came across your work many years ago and felt very deeply connected because I had come to the idea of quantum physics many times in my life, but it was always through what we lovingly call the woo people. And they would refer to quantum physics as, the scientific proof for whatever esoteric philosophy they were talking about. And it felt true, but I never really felt like their description of why and how was really going all the way. They would make some vague references to, an experiment here and there, and then move on. But when I found your work, and as a classically trained physicist with a PhD, you were the first person I encountered who was able to explain classical physics and classical quantum physics from the academic field in a way that A, made sense, and B, still connected it back to our beloved esoteric philosophies. So could you explain how you tell people what you tell people quantum physics is for those of us who are not physicists.
Okay, thank you. So quantum physics, I would say, is the physics that governs the most fundamental, the most basic building blocks of our universe, right? If we go down to the innermost core of everything, every atom, every particle, you go down to the innermost core of everything that makes up this universe, it is going to be built based on quantum physics. And the ways in which quantum physics tell us that these particles are allowed to interact and behave, and how they're not allowed to behave. And from there, the physics kind of expands, and the more you add in lots and lots of particles to build up more complex atoms, and then chemistry and so forth, they have to start statistically averaging out. And that's when we then get more of a Newtonian classical type interaction, and we work with the classical physics laws. But at the most core essence, we are quantum. And I think that what it ultimately is telling us is that we need to look beyond just the physical. For so long, science was so focused on what is the smallest particle, what are the smallest building blocks, and the more they continued to search deeper and deeper and have a higher energy experiments to be able to probe more deeply into matter, the more they found that it's actually not about the particles, it's about the fields. It's about the energy, and that there's infinite possibilities of what could be drawn forth from the quantum sea of potential. And it's like, in some ways, the more they just ramp up their particle accelerator energies, the more they get new particles coming out of this quantum field. And so it's like it's about the energy, it's about the field, it's about the interconnectivity and this infinite possibility that it presents us with when we can learn how to tap into it, when we learn how to probe it and also communicate with it. So I say ultimately we are quantum beings. The universe is quantum. Everything from the smallest particles all the way to intergalactic structures. Quantum physics is actually playing a really important role in how we and the universe function.
Thank you. That was beautifully simple. And it's so true. I remember in middle school learning what the smallest particle was. And then in high school, they're like, oh, no, it's different now. And then in college, not that I took science, but you hear things. So like, oh, no, now it's a quark. Now it's a,
right.
And I remember thinking, is this how we're going to stop? So the way that you describe physics, it is so clear that we are quantum beings. However, on my journeys, I came into this, through personal health and wanting to heal myself, and I discovered that it was actually considered completely untrue that there were quantum effects in biological systems, according to classical biology. So and there's been some great academic work done in the last 15 years to show that actually that was an incorrect conclusion. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, obviously the way you describe it, there's no question.
Yeah, it's really interesting because science, for hundreds of years, science was being driven by a very Newtonian model, right? All the way back to Isaac Newton. And it became, reduced to 4 different principles. There was that everything can be reduced to its parts, reductionism. Everything is deterministic, right? That we can predetermine and know, if we know the formulas, then we can know everything about a system and how it will unfold. That things are separate and isolated. So if we just, break down a whole into its separate components and understand how those components work, then we understand, the whole. And what I do in my laboratory here doesn't affect anything outside, so it's this sort of isolation model. And then that things are materially real, and ultimately it made the value system based on what's physical. and what's knowable and what we can rationalize our way through. And because of this, and there's a certain scientific dogma that started to set in to most of the scientific fields. And that dogma became its own mindset that started to limit the scientist's perception and willingness to even entertain certain ideas. So scientism kind of became its own form of religion, if you will. And so, with one of those ideas, for example, is that quantum physics only applies to very, fundamental particles. And it only applies, as you get to that super, super small scale. And that as soon as you start getting into larger numbers, they call them ensembles. When you get to these ensembles or larger numbers of particles interacting together, any quantum effects get averaged out. So once you move into the chemistry realm, quantum physics isn't supposed to have any effect. And especially when you get into the biology realm, it shouldn't have any effect. But now we're starting to see more and more experiments being done that are showing entanglement phenomenon, for example, where this is a quantum phenomenon where two particles that at some point interact and then are separated, that they remain connected even when they're separated by light years, for example, and they have this instantaneous connection between them. Well, now we're starting to see larger and larger systems, even all the way up to biology, have entanglement phenomenon, as a result of a certain coherence, right? So what's most important when it comes to quantum application is that things are in a coherent state. They're somehow synchronized together, but even at a biological level, that can happen. And we're starting to see that, for example, in some of the microtubules that work within various neurons and the nervous system itself. We're finding it in higher and higher levels of molecules also being entangled together. And so this coherence is really key, though. So just because, and so science generally has believed that you can't get that level of coherence unless you're like at near absolute zero temperatures, which biology can't function at. But now they're finding that that's not entirely the case. There are other ways to get this sort of coherence within the biological level. So I personally believe, though, that the thing that science is leaving out and maybe starting to open up to exploring is the consciousness factor. And that, so like I remember when I was in grad school, I actually asked, I was at the University of Washington. I was really starting to get more educated on my own around things like biophotons and the potential of biophysics and quantum and the possible correlates of consciousness. And I actually asked my professors at one point, could I do my dissertation research in consciousness and how quantum physics, interacts maybe, in the brain or something along those lines. And I literally was told, please do not embarrass this organization with such soft pseudoscience kind of stuff. So, so they really were not open to it at that time. And that, that was back in the early 2000s. And so, but by now, I think that there's much more openness starting to come back into the field with younger generations moving forward and becoming professors. There's more openness, but there's still like this, we're in this transition still between this old paradigm, materialistic way of viewing everything to this shifting into a new paradigm where we are starting to look at the consciousness factor and more interdisciplinary. Like I also wanted to do interdisciplinary research at the time, and it was very hard to find. And it wasn't well funded either. And so you had all this separation between the various branches of science, and they didn't even speak the same language. Like I shifted at some point from doing neutrino physics research to doing crystal chemistry and material science, and I literally had to learn a whole new language and way of thinking to understand how do we approach this research. So even you would think that physics and chemistry are next of kin in the scientific way of approaching things, but they are very different in their mindset, in their approach, in their culture, and even in their terminology. It's they speak. The academic world kind of creates silos within itself because of all of its nomenclature, and they like to. You got to be an expert to know what to.
So even if you wanted to cross-reference, it's very difficult because everyone's using different terminology, different formulas, different everything.
Yeah. The nomenclature, like in chemistry, for example, there's a lot of Latin that's being used, and the naming of various chemical processes and molecules and so forth. Whereas in physics, it's, you don't really get that. But then you get, a lot of acronyms in physics. And, so it's, you have to really be determined when you're trained in one way of thinking. So for example, also as a physicist, I was trained to do everything from first principles, that you need to understand the math. You got to work it all out, derive it first, and dot every I and cross every T before you go to the experiment. Whereas in chemistry, it was like the opposite. They're like, throw the chemicals together, see what comes out, and then try and figure it out. It's like completely different mindset. So it was like, it took me a real, quite a period of years to adjust from one way to the other. But I ultimately made my own interdisciplinary way of working through the scientific field.
That's amazing. And, I think that's probably the way forward. I took the name quantum biology from a book called The Coming Age of Quantum Biology. And I'm going to be honest, I don't remember the details of the science in that book. But what I do remember very clearly is in the foreword, the two authors, one was a biologist and one was a physicist. And the way they talked about daring to work together, it was like they were having an affair on their
on
their fields or something.
Yeah.
Like they met and they were like, what if we could help each other solve problem? Like, I don't know, will we get kicked out, will we get divorced? But I think obviously it worked out and they made some incredible breakthroughs. But I didn't, as an outsider to science, I didn't understand until I read that just how difficult it is for you all to work together.
Well, I think, so I've kind of explained part of it. And I think another part of it in the scientific field is there's a looming, there's sort of this fear, if you will, of losing credibility. And if you start venturing off into alternative subjects, you risk losing your credibility. And they kind of hold that over people. Like, don't go in that direction because you'll lose your credibility. It's soft science or whatever it is. Or you won't get funding because, so funding also drives scientific research. And what various funding agencies are willing to support is based on what they, some kind of agenda or some kind of thing that they really want to know, whether it's for technological purposes or there's some basic science or there's defense money, So there's certain agendas that you have to kind of figure out how to write your grant in a way that fulfills what they're wanting to fund. And it drives science. And I think a lot of people don't understand that, because sometimes you get the skeptics say, well, if consciousness has some quantum correlates, where's the proof? And why isn't there any research or more research on it? And it's like, well, there is research on it, but there's several things. One is funding. They can't get funded usually. Two is even if they self-fund and they do the research and then they try to publish, they get rejected just purely without even having read it or verified it. It just gets rejected because it's not the acceptable kind of topic. And then then there's the risk of credibility and tenure if you're professor. So there's all these kinds of complications that come in with the academic model in science. But I have seen there's more willingness. There's more courage now coming from people who are in those tenure positions, because it used to be a physicist, even if they believed in consciousness and that consciousness was primary, their entire career, they wouldn't say anything about it to their colleagues. And it wasn't until they retired that they would finally come out of the closet that they believed in something spiritual. And now we're seeing more and more who are in physics professorships and tenured positions where they are starting to come out and just be like, this is what I believe. And they're willing to argue it out. And, so there has been a shift in the last 10, 15 years, I would say. And that's really refreshing to see, although it wasn't when I was in grad school. So
right. And led to your leaving the profession and going out on your own.
Yeah. I decided I needed to follow my heart rather than just following the standard system.
Yes. So, I'd love to explore that a little bit. But first, I did want to talk for a minute about neutrinos. And so we, on this podcast, we talk a lot about light and how, biophotons interact with biology and how beautiful and amazing that is and good for our health and all those things. But tell us about neutrinos and what those are.
Yeah. So neutrinos are... they were discovered by, I think it was Pauli. He was one of the founding fathers of quantum physics. And as he was looking at different interactions based on what they were discovering at the time as laws of physics, he was seeing that there would be certain known particles coming in to an interaction, and then they would go out, like maybe it was just a scattering event, or maybe there was an actual exchange depending on the energy. But he also saw, as he was working out the equations, that there was something missing, and it seemed to be carrying away angular momentum and a certain amount of energy, but it had no charge and it had no mass. So it wasn't interacting via electromagnetism. And it was not interacting with mass, so gravitational effects that you wouldn't be able to look out into the cosmos and measure its gravitational effects, for example. And so they called it very weakly interacting, and it wasn't working via the strong force, which is more the nuclear, what holds a nucleus together. And so he called it the little neutral one, the neutrino. So there's a particle that has no charge, no mass. It's not one of the quarks that work via the strong force and create protons and neutrons. It's not an electron. It's not a photon. It's none of these other particles that they knew at the time. But it is abundant in the universe, and it's produced inside of fusion, nuclear fusion. So in the stars and in supernova, and jets out of galactic cores, like the black holes, when they have these sort of jets of plasma particles coming out. Neutrinos. So, like, for example, if there's a supernova somewhere out in the universe, the neutrinos will hit Earth first. If we're in the line of that, the neutrinos will hit Earth first before the photons do, because they don't interact with electromagnetism, so they don't get slowed down, whereas the photons get a bit slowed down in their interactions with various electrons and other things. So neutrinos are this really elusive particle, but that is created by the sun. It's created by supernova and so forth, and we're bombarded. We have neutrinos flowing through us like thousands, millions, and they interact, but only through the weak force, which is one of the four quantum physics forces. And so it can interact with us, but it's very weakly interacting. And so this is one of the things that I was involved in researching in my PhD studies was in order to even detect a neutrino, for example, we had this experiment that I was a part of called the Sudbury Neutrino Observatory, and we had to go a mile underground and a mile through the drift, of a mine, and so a mile through these tunnels, and then there was this big container, like almost like a reservoir, but it was round. It was spherical. And inside that, they had heavy water. So they had 1,000 tons of heavy water inside this big container. And it was ultra pure,
Wow.
right? And then they had all these photomultiplier tubes around it so that basically when a neutrino came in and it hit the heavy water, it would interact more so than with regular water, because there's an extra, is a deuterium, extra neutrons in there, and it would kick out a neutron from the heavy water, and then that neutron was what they called the neutral signal, and then we had to detect that with other form of detection. But it would also create these Cherenkov rings. So this is how we were measuring whether one, if there's multiple types of neutrinos, which there were. There's 3 different types of neutrinos. And just like there's 3 different types of what they call leptons, like electrons are one form of lepton. There's also muons and tauons. And these are part of the standard model of quantum physics. And then there's a neutrino that matches each of those families. And then they were also trying to detect whether it had mass or not, right? Whether it had a minuscule amount of mass or no mass, and whether they could oscillate. They did find that like an electron neutrino can oscillate to a muon and a tauon, and it's not until it's measured that we actually collapse the waveform, if you will, to see which type it is. So there was a lot of fascinating things about it.
In the academic model or the classic physics model that you were working in, was there a hypothesis or a theory as to whether neutrinos serve some sort of purpose? And then I'd be curious if you have your own esoteric thoughts on them.
So in the classical, or in the standard, I should say, standard physics model, the purpose is they're carriers of energy, right?
Okay.
That they just help carry away certain energy from different reactions that happen or interactions that happen at a nuclear level. Not nuclear physics necessarily, like in the sense of fusion or fission. It's not about fission so much, it's about fusion, but they carry energy. But I would also say if they carry energy, they carry information, right? Because information is in quantum physics, the more you look at it, the more you start to realize that even more fundamental than energy, because like Einstein's whole thing was that everything is energy, right? Mass and energy are equivalent essentially. But in a quantum physics model, it's actually everything is information. And information then from information emerges things like mass or energy or charge and so forth. So the more fundamental building block of the universe is information. And so then if we were to shift to an esoteric kind of perspective, a more spiritual perspective, I'm still kind of personally trying to wrap my head around it, but there are some both scientists and metaphysicians that I have met who believe that neutrinos are something that are attracted to our consciousness, and that they carry information, and that we can draw, like if you're meditating, you're coming into a more and more coherent state of being, that you can draw more neutrinos to you. And then there's another particle that are theorizing that's even smaller than a neutrino, called the igniton. Ignis, like being the Latin word for fire, and they think it's like the secret fire, and that this also comes like from the sun and so forth. And so they believe, and this is something that is being presented even on Gaia now. They had a little bit of it in their ancient civilizations, the most recent season 6, and in some of the later episodes, the last couple episodes, they talked a bit about it. And it's so that the idea is that the more coherent our consciousness becomes, the more we can attract both neutrinos and ignitons to us. And this then starts to amplify what we call the light body. And it, eventually there's certain ancient spiritual teachings that talk about like the rainbow body, the light body, the ascension body. And through various spiritual practices, it's like you're accumulating these extra particles into your field. Or maybe it's not really about the particles so much. I think they stream through us, but the information
Yes.
becomes more and more part of us. So this is, yeah, it's pretty cool.
Okay, I'm going to take a second to process all that. Wow. That's really cool. And it's, yeah, what's really, it's just all resonating so much. So as I said before, we talk a lot about biophotons and the sort of, standard scientific consensus is becoming that circadian rhythms are extremely important to overall health in every capacity. And every time a new paper comes out, it's like, oh my goodness, artificial light at night leads to all these terrible things. And oh my goodness, sunlight exposure is so much more important than we ever thought. And so there's that, and I have lots of like somewhat mainstream doctors who come on and talk about the importance of sunlight to health. And then you have the people who are more in our crew who have like this subatomic understanding. They're like, well, because light is information and it's coding into those biophotons are information that our body needs to function. And so now we're going even beyond, because it always seems to come back to being outside and having, not in like a necessarily a sunbathing way, although that's great too, but being connected to natural light as a source of health and coherence.
I think it would be nature in general. I mean, all four elements, right?
Mm-hmm.
So having even just being around running water, right? We know that running water creates a bit of an ionic field around it, and that can charge up our own field as well. Being earthed, right? Grounding and like walking barefooted on the earth, breathing in obviously clean air, right? And having that air that's circulating versus air that's stagnant. And yes, of course, the sun and receiving the light, that stimulation of the pineal and pituitary and so forth, that really rely on the light and vitamin D, all of it. We know that all of these elements, ancient wisdom teachings, you always talked about the four elements and how we need them to be in balance in our life, and that we needed to be connected with all four of them to have health. And so we might today in our scientific way of thinking about things say, well, the four elements, they're not really the four elements. They're not the most basic, right? We know more about them now, but it's still, like, from a human perspective and from our experience, it's still very much a fundamental need. We need these to thrive. And so I wouldn't discount the importance of the four elements in our lives and having them in a natural way.
Yes, absolutely. The grounding is important, and the trees are giving off information and reflecting light. Yeah, there's all of the pieces of it, for sure. But because we were talking about the neutrinos and all of these, all of this information that's coming down. Okay, so you've talked a lot about the word coherence, and in the the neutrino, the metaphysical idea of neutrinos. So they're coming through us at all times. They have information. Are you saying that we are more or less available to that information depending on our own personal coherence? And what do you mean by that word?
Okay, so let's start with, what do we mean by coherence, first of all? So coherence means that things are aligned. Think of a laser, right? Versus thinking of an incandescent light bulb, right? So in an incandescent light, you just have light sort of scattering, and it's a broad spectrum of frequencies that come out from that particular light bulb. But when you have an LED light or a laser light, it's a specific frequency. So everything is tuned to one frequency. Everything is Their waveforms are perfectly aligned with each other, so they're in phase with each other, and they're all moving in the same direction. So rather than being scattered in multiple directions, they're all moving in a laser-like fashion, all in one direction. So coherence is about really like having that laser focus. Now, from a quantum perspective, for example, we know that in order to like excite an electron from one orbit to another orbit, it takes a very specific amount of energy. So a photon would need to come in, or, whichever. So we'll just say with a photon needs to come in and it has to have a very specific energy, and then it can excite that electron up to a higher orbital state, a higher frequency state, if you will. And then when that electron ultimately de-excites and comes back to its ground state, it will release a photon of the exact same frequency. And if you bring in any other frequency of light, it's not going to, it's like it won't be enough if it's too low. And if it's too much, it might actually kick it out, right? So like X-rays, for example, when we get an X-ray, we want to minimize our exposure to X-rays because X-rays actually kick out electrons out of their atoms completely, and that's how we then do the imaging. So and then we have gamma rays come in from galactic sources. We have UV light, right? These are all different frequencies of photons and light. So coherence is really important, and in quantum physics, as I mentioned, like, if you have, for example, there's something called a Bose-Einstein condensate, which is where you have a lot of particles or a lot of atoms come together, but then they're cooled down to a lower energy state. But in this process, they end up getting rearranging themselves and connecting together in a way that they almost become like one particle, and they behave as one unit. And so the more they align themselves, the more it's becoming this new state of matter that they call the Bose-Einstein condensate. And so this coherence, in order to have quantum effects at a macroscopic level, you have to have more and more coherence of the various parts, the various pieces coming together and acting as one. So this is super important. I mean, in every way that you look at quantum physics, coherence plays a role. Now, when we talk about it at a biological level, we can talk about having coherence of our brainwaves, right? You can synchronize the hemispheres. You can have like more of a everything kind of coming into a particular frequency range. And we know from neuroscience now that different frequency ranges of brainwaves will relate to different states of consciousness. Not that the brain necessarily creates the state of consciousness, but it correlates with. And we can also talk about heart coherence, right? So your heartbeat, and you have variability in that heart rate. And when there's more coherence and it's consistent and not so erratic, then you're going to be in a more healing oriented state within your body. Usually that comes from being in gratitude, being in a place of appreciation, a place of joy, and so forth. And so this creates a more holistic state. You can take this idea of coherence to your gut, right? When your microbiome is coherent, like they're all synergistically working together because you have a healthy gut microbiome versus an unhealthy, imbalance of bad bacteria. That's where you get disease and issues, digestive issues, which then lead to, other diseases. So coherence is something we can talk about at every scale, every level of our being. And the more we're coherent, the more we are going to be healthy, we're going to thrive, but we're also going to be able to inform the quantum field, if you will. So I believe that consciousness, as we can bring our consciousness to a state of coherence, meaning quiet down that monkey mind, right? Instead of having all this distraction and frantic energy and whatnot that we tend to be exposed to in our modern, world, and especially in the urban sort of living, you get a lot of exposure to static. And in that static, it's like you can't really have a clear information that you're putting into the quantum field, right? Because it's going to have a lot of conflict and noise and all of that. Whereas if we really want to make a difference in that quantum realm, we have to have coherence going in. And so you have to kind of bring yourself to that stillness and silence within, but then also single pointed focus of what are you trying to inform and plant into the quantum field that you're then hoping it will give you back. So there is a way to communicate, I believe, using consciousness. And that's really what we do in the work that we're doing with the Quantum Learning Academy is very much about training people how to understand what is a quantum mindset, but then how to access what we call a quantum coherent state of being at multiple levels, and making sure that we're first accessing that proper state so that we can really then communicate with that quantum realm, and then use it ultimately to support our innovation, to support our manifestation, to create the kind of life we really want to be living.
That's beautiful. A beautiful explanation. And do you find that this coherence is affected by being around in groups?
Yeah,
Being around other people on the same path, or in certain cases not, depending,
yeah.
on being on the subway versus, being in a meeting where everyone's focused on the same thing.
Yeah. So there's this concept in science of entrainment. And it really, you can apply this concept of entrainment to any vibrating system. And pretty much everything is a vibrating system. Everything vibrates. So, when it comes to people, when you get a group of people together, they can entrain. But who are they going to entrain to, right? Are they going to entrain to the person who's holding the high vibes or the person who's holding the low vibes, right? And there is some choice in that. But just to kind of keep it simple, if you imagine you have two tuning forks, if you strike a tuning fork and that tuning fork vibrates then at a particular frequency, if you bring it within proximity of another tuning fork that's not yet vibrating but has the capacity, has the same ability to vibrate at that same frequency, and if you just hold them near each other, at some point this other tuning fork will start to vibrate with it. It'll entrain. And so I think entrainment really takes effect when you're physically exposed to vibrational frequencies. And this is where, like, even the whole concept of binaural beat brainwave entrainment, is when you wear the headphones and you have one frequency coming in one ear and another frequency coming in another ear. And maybe they're a little bit different. Right brain hears one, left brain hears a different, and they're trying to kind of find agreement into what they're hearing. It's a way to kind of trick the brain into synchronizing the hemispheres, because over the corpus callosum, they have to combine the signals, and actually inside the brain, you get a third signal, which is the difference between them. And they call that the binaural beat. And then you can kind of tune that beat frequency in to the specific brainwave levels that you want to entrain the brain to. So that's one way to do it with sound. But, and like a lot of the sound baths are really popular these days. And, when people are in a sound bath, that they're using the gongs and the bowls and the chimes and whatnot as a way to create a harmonic vibratory environment around you, which then will impact the cells of your body. It'll impact the ears and nervous system. Everything will receive that vibration and be entrained into it, because we are multi-vibrational. We have the capacity to vibrate at many different levels based on which level of your being you're looking at. And so when a group of people get together, who people tend to entrain to, I think often really depends on who's got the strongest will. And they're, kind of the they're either the big personality, or the one that everyone kind of finds some sense of rapport to, or, you might have two different people who are a strong resonator. And then from there, it's like, what are they choosing to engage in? Are they choosing to engage in the positive? Are they choosing to engage in the negative and the drama, for example? And then they'll kind of gravitate towards who they want to be resonating with. But yeah, you can definitely get amplified effects as well when you have a group of intentional people all come together. And, this has been shown by some of the work of Lynn McTaggart, for example, with her intention experiments, is you bring a group of people together and they're all focused on the same kind of process and the same objective, or ultimately service, to bring some healing to somebody else. And it amplifies the field. It amplifies the effect when you have many people coming together and focusing on the same thing.
Interesting. So I think about that because, the work that I'm doing or we're all doing together, so much of it is virtual. And I've been feeling lately that it would be really, for the next level, people need to see each other in person and have that in-person coherence and entrainment happening. And I'm excited to see what breakthroughs people have and what ideas they come up with when they are in each other's physical presence.
Yeah,
to experience that.
I think that there's a lot more people these days who are doing these intention experiments remotely, right? And so they're coordinating in time and maybe not in the same space, but in the same time, and yet they're linked through the internet. And I think that through the morphic field idea, the morphogenetic, and sort of the entanglement of consciousness, I think we could tune into a unified field. However, I would say that when you get together in person, you have a much more immediate and direct impact on the physical. So in-person work is always going to have an amplified effect versus trying to do everything remotely. And I do think that we need that contact. Like, humans are social creatures, right? We're going to be thriving more when we have that social connection, not just through technology, but through touch and through actual sharing of auric space, that we're in each other's fields. And there's a much more immediate ability to entrain and cohere with each other when we're together in person.
Right. Yeah, I've really noticed that we moved around a lot, especially during and after COVID. And I just locked into my people because my people were online and that's where they were. And I recently, where this is our third year here, and I went and joined a committee in the children's school district. And my husband was like, "Are you really sure you want to do that? You're kind of busy." And I was like, I need to go to a meeting with human beings who are in the same room with me, even if we're to talk about fundraising for the school party. I don't care what the top, that is meaningful to me, so I do care. But it was just what you're saying. I just had this deep need after so much virtual work to be with human beings at the same time and just work on something together.
Yeah. I remember during COVID seeing a video that I think just captured the whole importance of physical contact. Is, people, number one, we know how many people were having mental health issues and depression and so forth because even if they could get online interaction, they couldn't get in-person interaction and they were really isolated. But there was this one video of these kids who were kids that were best friends, and they were really young, like under 8 years old. And they couldn't be with each other and they couldn't hang out. They could talk to each other over Zoom maybe during COVID, but it was like once some of the restrictions started to reduce and they were able to get the kids together for the first time, the kids came together and they hugged and they started crying and crying and crying. They were just, it was so healing for them to be able to connect again in person, right? So we need that. We need that contact, and we need physical to hold physical space with each other. And I think that's super important for us to not lose touch with.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, what a beautiful story. Yeah, we really do. And when we're grown-ups, we're like, oh no, I'm fine. I've got all this happening, and we can skip over things here and there. Okay, I want to just touch on before we wrap the idea of alchemy, because one of the things that I really appreciate about your work, I appreciate the clarity of your communication. I find you to be very grounded, even when you're talking about extremely high level metaphysical stuff. There's a groundedness. But also, and this is like so dear to my heart, it's very practical. I find whenever I listen to you or watch one of your shows or one of your teachings, it always comes back to like, okay, so what does this mean in life? And you have a beautiful book where you have taken some of the concepts of alchemy. We don't have to go through all of them, but used them as a template for our own personal change, for organizational change, for societal change. So I just wanted to touch on that briefly because, again, it's a concept that is super esoteric to most people. I would say this audience probably would have some nodding acquaintance with alchemy in a positive way. But you have a deep understanding of it and also a very practical application. So just quickly tell us how you see alchemy and what that concept means through physics and through personal, organizational, societal change.
Yeah. So in my book, it's called The Game Changers, Social Alchemists in the 21st Century. And it's a easily digestible book, but so it's not huge. It's small, but it's packed with like just the essence. And I love it because it's like, okay, yes, there's alchemy from the scientific perspective, and here's like my first exposure to alchemy. I was well into my PhD studies at that point in physics, and I had been very much programmed with the mindset of alchemy. Well, that's just pseudoscience, and people in the Middle Ages trying to turn lead into gold, and we know that's not possible. And so this is my mindset around alchemy. When I first started getting exposed to it, I was really searching for practical ways to bridge science and spirituality. And, I thought, well, there's some great philosophy around Eastern mysticism, for example, like the Taoism or Buddhism, like these philosophies with quantum physics. And it's all great, but it's just theoretical or hypothetical. It's just philosophical, and it's not grounded, it's not applied. And so I knew that if we wanted to bring it into more applicability and tangibility and really, move the field forward, if you will, of bridging science and spirituality, we had to make it more practical. And so I was searching for that. And then alchemy just kept kind of being presented to me. And there was at least 3 times where it came up and I just said, oh no, I'm a real scientist. I don't have anything to learn from alchemists. But it just kept coming up and it kept coming up. So the universe was just like really giving me
all right.
lots of messages. And so I knew enough to, okay, I'm going to listen to the universe and just like empty my cup for a moment and suspend my my skepticism about it. And I'm going to read a book. And as I started reading about it, I realized that the true gold of alchemy is the wisdom itself, that it's not just about trying to turn lead into gold as we were sort of taught in our science history classes, but that there is a wisdom of the process of transformation. And it's basically at its most fundamental level, it's how to take any substance, any being, any, whether it's an herb or you or a mineral, and take it from a raw state to a more purified and perfected state. So it's this process of transformation, and there's these stages that we go through to get from that raw materia to that perfected materia. And these principles are universal. It's not really about our psychology. It's not about our belief system. It's not about, what we think about it. It's about it, this is just what happens. There's even alchemy at a cosmic level, like how we go from just like space dust to star formation. There's an alchemy at work that happens there as well. And so in my book, I talk about there's these 7 stages of alchemy. I think it would take a bit too long to go through all 7 stages of it right now, but the basic formula is this process of separating out the parts and purifying them. And then once they're purified, we bring them back together in a more synergistic way by recombining. And then we'll go through another round of separating again, purifying again, elevating and kind of raising their vibration, and then bringing them back together and finding, that perfect balance and combination of those elements. And they talk about what are called the 3 essentials in alchemy. There's the physical materia itself. They call that the body. There's the consciousness, the unique sort of attributes and qualities, the characteristics. They call that more the soul. And then there's what they call the spirit, which is the essence that makes it alive. But that spirit is kind of more universal. And so they always talk about these 3 essentials. And there's different forms of alchemy out there. You can see it in Chinese medicine. You can see it in Ayurvedic medicine. You have the Western system. There's multiple approaches to alchemy. It goes all the way back to ancient Egypt, probably even goes back further than ancient Egypt. And it is, the more I started to learn about it, the more I was like, wow, no, this is what's happening even in our personal growth. Right. And also like, wait a second, science came out of alchemy. Like before we called ourselves scientists, we called ourselves alchemists. And in the alchemists, like they did not separate the spirit or the soul from the body. They saw it all as really essential, all 3 of them. Whereas materialist scientists kind of started separating out the mind and the soul and the spirit and said, that's for the realm of religion. We're going to just focus on the material part of it. We're going to focus on the body, the chemistry, and the bottom line. But all of our modern medicine, our modern pharmacology, also herbal medicine, and homeopathic approaches, and all of these fields came out of alchemy. So to me, I see it as a perfect place if we want to reconnect science and spirituality, we got to go back to its roots, which is the alchemical tradition. And I like to also apply it to our personal growth. So as we are evolving our own consciousness, our own soul, and we're going through various stages of growth, we go through these same 7 stages. A bit of breakdown, a bit of, kind of emotional, like not sure what to make of all of this. And then we get back to clarity, and then we find our new self. And then we go through, sometimes we might have to root out deeper impurities and go through a little bit of a dark night and let go of attachments. But then ultimately we break through and we come into higher and higher practices. But what you'll find in the higher steps, like the later steps of the alchemical process, most of the first 4 steps kind of will happen naturally if you're even somewhat applying yourself. But the final 3 steps really require a lot more personal attention, will, patience, and knowledge and higher keys or wisdom of how to move those steps forward successfully. And often what people get to is they get to that point where they're starting to feel good again after they've been through a transformational sort of phase. They get to the point where they feel good again and they get back in their comfort zone. And then, they don't actually complete all the way through. So I feel that when you know the alchemical steps, it really gives you a roadmap to how to keep moving through all the stages so that you can perfect it and stabilize it and integrate it rather than kind of backsliding again. And then we can apply this not only to ourselves, but we can apply this to the world, to human collective consciousness and our societal transformations that we're going through right now. And these are some of the things I cover in the book as well.
Yes, and I found, as I was saying, I found super helpful. And I do remember that part where, because you have to remember how many stages there are, and you have a breakthrough, and especially, if someone's been unwell and they get better, and um and then you feel unwell again, and it's like or you fall off, or the problem comes back. And I remember there's a part in the book and you're like, no, wait, you're not finished. There's still more stages. Don't give up yet.
Mm-hmm.
Like that first, it's almost like that first breakthrough is really the beginning.
Yeah, yeah, it's the midpoint. But it's sort of like when you're climbing a mountain and you get to base camp, you get to this sort of halfway point, and then you look and you're like, oh, I've still got all that mountain to climb. It really takes more determination and discipline and dedication to getting all the way through, but it's really rewarding when you do. You'll have hugest sense of accomplishment and victory when you do it. And, you can just look at, for example, just look at COVID by itself and the travel industry and what the travel industry had to go through when COVID hit, right? The rug got pulled out from under it. The whole thing was shut down, right? It was a real massive wake up call. And so then they had to start looking at, okay, what are our practices? How do we sanitize more? How do we make sure everything's clean? How do we make it safe again for travelers? Otherwise, we're going to lose the whole industry of travel. And as we started to open up again, there was all these protocols that they were doing. They give you these sanitizing wipes. They sanitized and cleaned all the seats and all the tray tables and everything. And the airports have never been so clean that time, and everyone was having to wear masks and kind of be more mindful of the impact that you have on other people that you're sharing this space with. And where are they at today, right? What did they learn from that experience, and how much of those good practices to clean up have they maintained, right? And I travel a lot, and I would say they've backslid back to how it was before. And I really hope that we don't have to repeat that lesson again.
Please no.
I know. Maybe next time we'll be able to get to it faster and pick it up faster. But it's an example of getting to that midpoint, and you get comfortable again, and things kind of go back to what seems normal. But okay, now we're past the hard part of it. And then you just sort of go into that comfort zone and stop doing all the extra good practices. But that's where the backslide then starts to happen. So it's like we have to continue and integrate those good practices and make them a way of life, rather than just kind of letting go of the good practice.
Right. All the things that we did to start to feel better, or lose weight, or not be depressed.
Mm-hmm.
We have to keep them. They have to become the way of life, not just a temporary solution to the problem.
Right.
For a true alchemical change to occur.
Right. So we conquer our first nature, which is sort of, falling into the comfort zone, and, that sort of laziness of the animal self. And you got to conquer that and apply more the discipline and the good practices, whether it's meditation, exercise, eating well, sticking to it, rather than just going on this crash course and then dropping it all together. We have to create those little adjustments that become a way of life, and then you just maintain it. Then you build a new platform upon which you can rise higher. But it's got to be integrated into your way of life, for sure.
And where do you see that we are as a collective through that lens?
Well, I have seen over the last, since at least 2016, maybe earlier, but yeah, 2016, I felt like we started going into a dark night of the soul, of at least in the Western world. But that's actually the 5th stage. So while it seemed really dark and kind of fearful, there was a lot of fear that humanity's been facing over the last many years. There has actually been some forward movement from an alchemical perspective. So it's this fifth stage, we call it the fermentation stage. It's, I like to use the analogy of the butterfly, the caterpillar becoming the butterfly, the metamorphosis. And I do explain this in the book, but essentially caterpillar, as it goes into its chrysalis, it completely breaks down into this soupy mess. And, so there's the breakdown of the old system. But that old system kind of had lived out its time. And there's a trigger inside the DNA saying, no, you have to evolve or transform, metamorph into this more beautiful thing. But to go through that transformation, that metamorphosis, we have to go through this soupy mess. And there's, this place where certain old cells attack the new cells, and then the new cells have to kind of bond together and form strength, find strength in numbers, and then they got to diversify, and then eventually that new structure starts to come through. So I see, for example, in the world right now, there's a lot of new paradigm systems that are trying to move forward and emerge. I mean, whether you're talking like just from the tech perspective, you've got AI, you've got quantum computing starting to come forward. We've got all these wearables and stuff from a medical perspective. There's a lot of innovation happening in medicine. You've got blockchain. I mean, there's so many different new paradigm ways of approaching things that are starting to come in, but they're fighting against the old system because they're a threat to the old system in a way. It's like, well, if we do it that way, then this old way loses control. And so we're sort of in that struggle still, but I think that we're starting to make a breakthrough. It's almost like that point where the butterfly is formed inside the chrysalis, and then the chrysalis starts to break open and light shines into the darkness, and you can start to see that, oh, there's this new form that's emerging, but it has to kind of struggle its way out of the chrysalis. And if you were to go and see a butterfly trying to struggle out of its cocoon or its chrysalis, and you were to like feel sorry for it and try to intervene and help it out, it wouldn't get strong enough to be able to fly. So it has to struggle on its own to get out of that chrysalis, because that struggle is what strengthens the structure and the wings of this butterfly so that it can actually, take flight down the line. And and even when it gets out of that struggle, it's going to need a little bit of time to rest and dry off and kind of regather itself before it finally can take flight. So we're kind of in that stage where we're struggling out of the chrysalis. There's this new paradigm coming in. There's still a struggle with the old paradigm, but we have to go through the struggle, and it's not easy. But we're moving more and more into the light and out of that dark stage, I think. So I think we're in this transition at the moment. If you read my book, we're in this transition between the fermentation and the distillation stage. But here is where we really need to be conscious and intentional and proactive and disciplined with how we continue to move the process forward. Because if we don't participate with it, it will kind of backslide, or it won't integrate into a new way of life. So we're at a really critical time on the planet and in our modern world. And so I think the people who really want to be part of that solution and be part of the change, they need the right knowledge. And that's why I love alchemy, is because it kind of gives us that roadmap of, okay, this struggle that we're going through is actually worthwhile. It's part of the process. And also, I think the new paradigm shift in consciousness that needs to happen is also out of this old Newtonian way of thinking and into a more quantum way of thinking. And so that quantum paradigm is something that we teach within the Quantum Learning Academy. And we actually have a program coming up in April in Reno, Nevada, where it's called iQuantum, where we'll really take 3 days to dive deep into what are these quantum principles and how do they apply? What do they mean? And how can we adapt it as a mindset? And what does that do for us? And then how do we actually achieve a quantum coherent state? We have a meditation technique called the quantum meditation technique that we guide people through to really learn how to achieve that quantum coherent state, or what are the keys to it. So we're very excited.
That sounds fun. I'm going to come.
Yeah, well, you can learn all about it at quantumlearningacademy.co.
.co. Okay, so
.co.
quantumlearningacademy.co. Perfect. And there's live events coming up. I'm sure there's probably recorded material in there as well.
Yeah, we also have a webinar coming up that will, I think it's in early February, that will be just sort of a free webinar to help people kind of get a sense of what is the iQuantum event all about, and a little bit more of what we do. So that's coming up also. That's online.
Perfect. Well, Teresa, I'm so glad that you followed your heart to leave academia. Their loss, but your work is it's the framework of it is just such an important guide, especially right now. I've been communicating with people lately. Just what you're saying, it's like we got to stay alive, people. Like this is the moment. I don't know what's happening, but we're here for it. So thank you so much for being here and sharing your deep wisdom. Much appreciated.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
This has been the Quantum Biology Collective podcast. To find a practitioner who practices from this point of view, visit our directory at quantumbiologycollective.org. If you are a practitioner, definitely take a look at the Applied Quantum Biology Certification, a 6-week study of the science of the new human health paradigm and its practical application with your patients and clients. We also love to feature graduates of the program on this very podcast. Until next time, the QBC.